then I'm going to call this meeting to order. I think we're all here. The first thing on our agenda is to elect a committee chair because it's that time of year. I have enjoyed being the Ops Committee Chair, and I'd like to throw my name in for another year term.
Good, we have seconds for nominations.
As long as y'all agree.
I'll move to nominate.
Okay.
Lisa Williams as chair. Sorry, we could make it more formal. I was just sort of waiting to see what we were supposed to do next.
Vote.
Yeah, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Denzel Washington.
Perfect. Next, approve minutes. We've got 2 meetings worth of minutes to approve, and they are old, but they're from October and November of last year. Did anybody have any changes or issues that they saw with either of those? Then I would take a motion to approve those minutes.
So moved.
Second?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Awesome. All right, let's move on then to attendance support busing, our presentation tonight. And Deputy Superintendent Ramey, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Director Williams. First, thanks to the committee for switching the dates of the ops. It really helped us out with some things that were going on. And we're excited about this topic. It's important, but as much as I love FMP 2.0, I'm also excited that this is the first kind of non-FMP thing we've talked about at ops in a while, and we maybe can come back to the end, but we hope to provide more robust set of topics away from facilities over the course of the year, and we are starting with attendance support busing. One of the people not at the table with me this evening, beyond Superintendent Degner, is Esme Davis. She's our coordinator for transportation, and she does a lot of this work. One of the reasons she's not here is one of the challenges that's associated with this work is the shortage of drivers. And so Esme has been driving for us the last 2 days, which is also why, while we do have the report posted now, we had some difficulty getting the data finalized because she's been driving. And I think it really underscores one of the challenges that we're having overall in staffing, but specifically as it comes to transportation, is enough drivers. And it's one of the things we'll talk about later, which is directly aligned to something I think that the board has gotten some feedback on this year already. I provided 2 documents. Actually, they're both technically posted online, but only one is forward-facing. It's the presentation for this evening that should really hopefully kick off some discussion. The blue on the white, and that's what I'm going to speak from. The attendance support busing that has the red and the bus driver on the bus in the front. This is the last report that came to the board back in 2019. And so I'll refer to a lot of things, and it's actually from this report. And so it's just to help give you some context of where we've been. And I know you haven't had a lot of time to look through the presentation, but just to kind of give you a roadmap of what we're going to do this evening is talk about the transition from discretionary busing to attendance support busing, some of the factors that were utilized, where we are today, some of our challenges associated with the budget, and then just open up to discussion. We have some next steps that we've suggested, but also want to talk to the committee about where you all are on this and how we see this moving forward. So as we look at the proposal, really, the first slide is just about district transportation options. We have 3. Under state law, we're required to provide transportation to individuals that live more than 2 miles from their attendance center at the elementary level and 3 miles at the secondary level. Actually, we're not required to provide transportation. We're required to provide transportation or some sort of equivalent payment to those families if we don't want to provide them transportation. We're not in a rural district that's required to do that. It's more cost effective for us to provide the busing, so we do. You'll see that for this year we have about 3,200 students that receive that state mandated busing.
Chase,
yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. The junior highs, do they fall within the 3 mile? The secondary, okay.
That's a good question. So the junior highs and the high schools are at the secondary level. So would a middle school, actually. So we're already talking about how that's going to change and impact our busing as we move to middle schools, because we will see that difference in that 2 to 3 mile radius. We also have pay to ride, and then what we're going to spend our time on tonight is attendance support busing. But just something on pay to ride. This is a service that is basically, think of it as space available. So that if families live in neighborhoods or close to bus routes, but they fall inside our walk zones, but we have a bus that goes close to them, and there's spots available on the bus, we will allow them to pay to ride the bus. We don't put additional buses into operation to create those pay-to-ride routes normally. There's a couple exceptions. And so it's really space available type things. We also look at it under free and reduced lunch status. And so while there is a cost to students, it would also be full pay for meals. We have a reduced rate for students that are on reduced lunch, and students that qualify for free lunch get to ride pay-to-ride for free. They still have to apply, and the other rules about space being available still apply to it, but there is no charge for those families.
Do our FRL families get priority for those spaces?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Les, do you know the answer to that?
I believe the answer is yes, but it's a first come, first serve on the application process. So if they happen to be the last one to apply and there's no spaces available, they can't bump somebody who took action previously. But we can follow up with Esme on
Okay.
that.
We can check on that, but I think we haven't normally done it with first come, first. So I think what Les is saying, right, is if everybody applied at the same time, we do that. But if there's 5 seats available on a bus and we give them away, and then somebody that's free and reduced would then apply later, we can't bump somebody out of the pay-to-ride program that we've already given a seat to.
That's how I interpret, because I think that there's a window in the
Yes.
spring or summer, and I would
Correct.
assume that that's when we rank them. But then if a family applied in October after,
And there was no space.
and there was no space, then we're not gonna kick
Yeah.
something off. Okay. But in that application period, they're bumped to the top of the list.
And I'll get some clarity on that for you.
Okay.
Along that line, are we keeping a pretty good idea of kids who are in that category where they're income qualified, but there's not a space in the route?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that detail that Esme had
We do
had
have
the
that
status
detail,
of all of the
Charlie.
kids, so.
I just don't have that number of
2
students.
hours I
that-
had to study this.
It's not in there. The percentage of kids, all we included in there was the number of that they did not have to pay. I did not break that down, but that is a good point. We should do
And I
that.
apologize. Chief.
No.
I should be-
It's, you're not being mean. We just didn't break down to that level. So attendance support, so that leaves attendance support busing. And this is a program that has been developed in the last 7 years to provide transportation for students that live within the walk zones, but a committee determined that not necessarily those students, but those neighborhoods or those streets had what they considered extensive SES challenges that then created transportation barriers. And so the attendance support busing was a way to eliminate those barriers to getting those students to school. And that's really what we're going to focus on tonight. And for 22-23, it's 713 students. To the questions about free and reduced lunch, we could make some assumptions, but again, it's by kind of neighborhood and area. And so those decisions were made, and you'll see this a little bit later, at more of a global level based on group statistics, not on the individuals that would be at those specific bus stops. A little bit of history, if you go to the next page. And as I said, this is something that's been developed over the last 7 years. Back in January of 2015, just in the normal course of business, we sent a memo to the board talking about transportation, and through that update, they asked for more information. We put a proposal together that spring to eliminate discretionary busing, and the board rejected that, but said, we want you to put together a plan that has more objective criteria of how we might provide some of these options. And so that work was done. Over the next year or so, we opened Alexander during that time, so that kind of gave us a test case to look at that work. A committee was brought together, several updates were provided, And then on January 16, 2016, the school board voted to eliminate discretionary busing and replace it with attendance support busing. The biggest change, I think I detail this out, I do a little bit, but really one of the biggest changes from discretionary busing to attendance support busing is there was a heavy influence on safety with discretionary busing. We also were in a budget crunch, if you remember back in that 2015, 2016, and so we had to be more efficient with our transportation funding, but also had to figure out a way of, okay, we know there are kids that have these barriers, how are we going to do it? And so what came out of that change, we don't really need to look at the timeline, if you look at that next page, or the next two, is this change from discretionary busing that was a lot based on safety issues to more reducing transportation challenges for families that were facing socioeconomic barriers to getting to school. We eliminated 7 of those elementary routes. We had 17, and so 7 were eliminated. We kept 10 of those routes. You see them listed there on that third bullet: Corvallis, Central, Hills, Horn, Lucas, Twain, Van Allen, Weber, Wickham, and Alexander. And then we already had pay to ride at the time, so we had 2 additional routes that were pay to ride: Horn and Lucas. Again, 0 cost for the FRL families. And then we added Kirkwood as an attendance support busing route. So the 2016-2017 is when we really made this first move from discretionary busing to this idea that we were going to look at attendance support busing based on these SES factors.
Can you pay to ride on an attendance support bus if there's room?
Yes.
Yeah,
Good question.
just curious.
Yeah.
We do
Yeah,
have.
because once a bus is in the area, if there's spaces, and because we're going to talk about Lincoln here in a second, or you look at any of our elementary buildings, there are some of our buildings that, because of how condensed the population are, there are no buses to there, but the attendance support busing is, might be for a certain neighborhood, and so if you're students that live even closer to school, that bus would travel along that route, we could set up a bus stop there potentially.
Chase, are we making those kinds of decisions?
That's what we're going to talk about tonight, Charlie. That's what we're going to ask for you all a little help on. But no, then you see during 18-19 we looked at secondary and maintained some routes at Southeast Junior High and at City. The majority of our busing is at the elementary level, so it's not a surprise that the majority of our attendance support busing routes are there at the elementary as well. And Charlie, to your question on that next slide, elementary attendance zone changes and modifications, we'll skip the first 2 bullets, but that 4th bullet, those are the factors considered in prioritizing potential routes for attendance support busing. Number of students in the area, the distance from the neighborhood to the school, number of ELL students, number of McKinney-Vento students, average age of students, and the access to public transportation in the area is what this committee utilized back in 16, 17, and then again in 19 when they looked at these factors again. We did relook at this in the winter and spring, winter of 18 and spring of 19 due to the openings of Grant and the new Hoover. Obviously, when we redistribute students to different schools, it creates those changes. And so those data points were weighted by the committee, and that's why you need this report, Charlie. So a little bit of that detail is in this report, but I'll admit, I tried to pull on documents because in the appendix, I have all of them linked. So if you wanted to go back and look at all the different documents, you just pull it up on Board Docs and you can get them. Not being critical, just being transparent. In this report that was presented to the board, it gives those factors and it gives those scores, but it doesn't really give the rubric behind. And so that's something that is a piece of the puzzle that I don't have for you tonight. So it doesn't actually lay out, oh, well, there's 1 to 4 points available for number of of ELL students. There's 1 to 3 points available for distance. So I have to, I mean, again, not critical. They were building this as they go, and I think they did a really nice job. It's just I don't have that piece of the puzzle for you, for us to look at. But that is where this part of where we looked at that is where this report comes in. So we have it set up. It works for a couple of years. We have to redo our attendance zones at the elementary. So of course that brings the committee back together. And so the attendance support busing comparison, 2016 to 17 to 2019-20 slide, it really shows you the routes that we had in 16-17 compared to the schools, and then the schools we had in 19-20. Borlaug and Hoover are in blue because they were added in that left-hand column. Coralville Central, Hills, Kirkwood, Lucas, Van Allen, and Wickham are in a lighter shade of gray because they didn't make that score cut, and so they came out of attendance support busing. Yes, given the continuing struggles we have financially, the number of routes did go down, but it didn't go down as drastically as that looks. Alexander actually has 3 support buses to support the neighborhoods, and
Weber also has
Thank you.
3,
Thank
and
you.
Southeast has
Thank you.
2.5.
Weber has 3 and Southeast has 2.5. Thanks, Les. And then you'll also see that, again, this speaks to those attendance changes. Wickham had a route at 22nd, 23rd Avenue. Kirkwood had a route for kids that lived in 22nd and 23rd Avenue that had been attendance support busing up until 1920. When we redid the boundaries, we moved those kiddos to Wickham. So that pushed that route from attendance support busing outside the 2-mile barrier and made it state mandated busing. And so it looks like Kirkwood lost a route. Kirkwood lost a route because those kiddos got moved to a school that was more than 2 miles away from where they lived. And so what had been attendance support busing became mandatory busing for them. And I just realized I didn't put page numbers on these. Sorry. Okay, so then the last iteration of this is the current attendance support busing. Same as we did in 2019. And so those same schools, those same routes, 14 buses serving approximately 713 students. Where the challenge has come is because this hasn't gone back to the board and we've been locked into those, we haven't had a mechanism, or the directive from the board, or even in this report that came from the administration several years ago on this topic wasn't, hey, let's set up a formula where we look at this every spring. It just kind of sat stagnant. And so this is where the first time we brought this back to the board conversation. I mentioned earlier the Lincoln neighborhood. For the last couple of years, we have offered a bus to a neighborhood that sits off of Riverside Drive in Myrtle, kind of in that area across from the Dairy Queen. And I point to Les. It's not Les's Christmas tree lot, but one of Les's community service projects is to sell Christmas trees there at the winter.
That's where we get ours.
We start a month from today. No. Or 2 months from today. No, a month from today, yeah.
Yeah.
We've provided a pay-to-ride bus, or a bus that was coupled with a tiered route to that neighborhood, free of charge to those students to transport them to Lincoln. At the same time, there's also a neighborhood behind the Come and Go on Mormon Trek that goes to Weber. After some feedback from the community, we were also able to, again, provide a tiered route for a bus that wasn't needed until secondary for those students to go to Weber. They weren't part of attendance support busing. We were able to utilize basically spare routes that we had already through the pay-to-ride program, or just because we had an odd number of routes, or even though we double tier, it just sometimes doesn't work timing to maximize those buses. So we were able to incorporate that. Well, because of the reduction number of routes this year, accompanied with the driver shortage, we weren't able to offer those routes. And there was this misunderstanding of where those routes came from. because we just talked about them as part of our attendance support busing program. But they really weren't that. And if you look at this, you can see that there isn't a bus route for Lincoln in attendance support busing, even though we were able to do that. Well, that's one of the challenges and why we need to go back and look at this. I will tell you that if we did, we should go back and do this analysis, because I'm not sure today, based on some of our feeder patterns where people live, those numbers might fall out the exact same way as they did even 3 years ago. But we are not in a financial position to add those routes, and even if we were, right, Esme's not here because she's driving, there's no insurance that we could even get drivers. One of the other pieces of this proposal, this is kind of a bird walk a little bit, and some of you might remember this, is that when we sent students across attendance zones to Northwest from the Alexander attendance area when they went to junior high, one of the things we put in place was support busing for after-school activities. It wasn't very well utilized at the time, but we've tried to resurrect that using even vans rather than buses. We're ready to go, but we can't find drivers. And so we're having a significant staffing challenge in some of these pieces as well. And it's not an excuse, it's just part of the reality. And so before I open it up to discussion, I kind of highlight some of this on budget considerations. We currently provide 85 routes at an operating cost of approximately $3.7 million per year. 3 sources, 1.3 from the general fund, 1.3 charged to special education, and 1.1 from PEPL. We're able to charge off part of PEPL for the operating expenses associated with it, since we have an outside provider, and so for some of those costs that are rental of the buses to put it in most general terms. It is interesting, right, that half our routes are special education routes, but we are able to charge those to special ed. You cannot pay to ride on special education routes. It's because of how we charge that off. And so that is how we break that down as we look at that. Even with 14,500 students, I mean, we are pretty compact as far as it goes in terms of districts here in the area. You look at the number of our schools, especially as we look in the Iowa City area, we have some schools that the only buses they have are special education buses, because everybody in their attendance area is within the walk zone.
We can't pay for ride for the special education buses. Can we include state mandated transportation students along with special education?
Well, yes, and because, right, under the IDEA and under IEPs and least restrictive environment, if students can ride the general ed bus, we should be putting general ed students on those buses. And so these are really specialized buses that are needed. I hear what you're saying, but
Well, I'm just trying to figure out if some of our state mandated routes are paid for with special education dollars because we have special education students on those routes.
I don't think we can.
It just has to be
Be
the
special ed.
special
Special ed.
education bus. We can only bill from that.
and about half of those, Lisa, are midday routes.
Okay.
So I didn't caveat that. Those aren't all 8 in the morning routes and 4 o'clock afternoon routes. There's a number of midday routes. You see the cost, roughly $52,000 round trip. There are some other things that Leslie can go into if we did a more robust, in-depth budget presentation. So I'll admit here, that math is not going to add up to 3.7 if you would just take 85 times 52. It's not going to be the same. There are some other factors involved in that we have to pay under our contract with Iowa Central, but that's roughly what we look at. And then we see that we generate approximately $700,000. We spend $700,000. Excuse me. I skipped a bullet. We spend $700,000 on attendance support busing this last year, and the bullet above that, we receive approximately $70,000 for pay to ride. And so we're not trying to make money on pay to ride. It's about $550, $575 for a full paid student. for the year to get busing. And I know that you've been contacted by a family in North Liberty about even where their driveway is, and so we know families are looking at a number of different perspectives on this. But we do try to have some options that are available. I know that's a little bit outside of the attendance support busing, but I think that's an important piece. And so,
And the pay-to-ride rate is set by our transportation report that's filed with the state from the year before. So that's the maximum that we can charge. So we can't, as to Chase's point, we can't use it as a moneymaker or gouge people for it. It's the maximum is set there.
so I think in recommended next steps, before we would open it for discussion, of course, entertain any next steps or directives from the committee, is that unfortunately, we do not recommend any changes or additions to attendance support busing or pay to ride for this year, mainly because we understand our financial circumstance, and number two, we cut routes because we didn't have people to actually drive those routes. And so even if we had the drivers, I'm not sure we would sit here and tell you our recommendation would be to bring some of those attendance support, or add attendance support busing routes before we would look at, are we most effectively serving our students that live beyond the 3-mile radius in terms of how long are kiddos on buses, are we getting them to school? And so it wouldn't be as easy to say, let's just generate one more bus route and it's gonna go here. The board could, I should say that. The board directed us to do that, we would obviously do that, but I think if we had additional funding for it, we couldn't say that would be the first add. We do think this is something that we need to look at, so we need to reconvene the district transportation committee to review not only the current routes, but also the criteria that we utilize to better flesh those out, to develop a public rubric that we have that works behind that, and then put a process in place where we look at that every year, that we are continually going back and looking at how things are changing, and not letting that sit stagnant, so that we're continuing to readdress that and consider the transportation budget within the context of the district's overall budget. That first bullet about recommendations for this year, quite honestly, if we get if Leslie gives us our first budget projection later this month and it looks great, we might say something different. But
Leslie's budget projections never look great, as you know.
Yeah. Well, I was trying to assume positive intent.
And I'm going to pass it to the legislature.
And then we would do that work over the next couple of months, and we would bring back a recommendation for changes to attendance support busing for next school year in the spring of 2023, so we can give families notice of what that would look like. So with that, it's an overview, historic, kind of tell you where we are, but then just hopefully generate some conversations. We'll try to answer any questions that we have and talk next step.
Chase, this is not a criticism, it's just something that these reports primarily about bus routes. So now I'm trying to figure out what students are not getting to school helps their education. And if there's one, that's fine, do one, but if there's 100, there's something else. And I don't know if there's a way to figure that out.
Well, so I thought a question like that might come up, and I thought about that a little bit, and I think one thing that we need to do, and we have two areas where we can look at it. We have this neighborhood from Weber, and we have this neighborhood that goes to Lincoln. And one of the comparisons, and I reached out to the principal at Lincoln, and she didn't have great data for me, so we need to really revise it, is we know we provided a bus for the month of all of last year, right? So one thing we could do is we could look at attendance rates for families from the Douglas Street to Douglas Court for the first 7 weeks of school last year, as compared to attendance rates from that same neighborhood this year. Now, it's not perfect comparison. There's a lot of factors that could play into that, but it at least gives us some sort of kind of window into have we seen a tremendous drop-off in kids going to school from last year to this year when that transportation hasn't been provided. They did do that analysis several years when we were looking at Alexander because they did in the interim, I apologize, I don't remember the history, but there was a several week period where the buses wasn't provided, and they actually didn't see a significant drop off, so I don't think that's the only factor to consider, because we don't know what families are giving up to make sure they get their kids to school. Are parents being late to work? Have they had to give up their jobs? So I don't think it's fair just to say, well, because we haven't seen a dip in attendance, they don't need that bus, because we don't know what other sacrifices they're making. But it's one of the things I thought through would at least give us an initial look at that. But Charlie, the rest of your question, I'll have to think more how we would look at that, because unless a family contacts us and says they're having a transportation challenge, we don't know how much of a transportation challenge it really is for them to
And
get
I
to
was
school.
thinking that too, that we do give communications to families
Mhm.
about their transportation desires and or needs. My inclination has been system to take those communications into account. I'm so sure that there's a way to do that. Inside here,
I don't really, but I of course care, and I'm glad people reach out to us, but I would have to base decisions on a lot more than a few families' experiences. I know a family reached out to me, and the gentleman described the exact circumstances I had when I had 3 kids, and he didn't want to make the same accommodation in his day that many of us do, and he had the ability to do it. And so I just kind of had to say back, yeah, no, it stinks. I mean, there are times when people are going to have to make those accommodations if they're able, and some people are able. So I don't, anecdotally doesn't really help me. I'd like to know more about attendance support busing, what the data was that supported us doing that. I just would need to know way more about ASB and where it came from. Like, what I would think that's where the evidence would have been about, if we don't provide busing, X percentage of students don't show up, Y percentage of the time. I don't have any data about that, so.
How do I say this delicately? I don't have to say it delicately because I don't know if there. I'm not sure it exists. In all honesty, as I read through all those documents that I put in the appendix, I really tried to pull on, because I wasn't. First off, I was here, but I was only doing HR, so I wasn't part of a lot of that work prior to 2016. Then I left, and when a lot of this work happened, I wasn't here. And when I got back, I didn't take over transportation until after this report came out. But I think this is pretty solid, and they list those factors. But that switch that got made back in 2015, to your question is what data was driving that? I think it was partly a budget decision that we couldn't continue with the amount of discretionary bus routes that we had. And there wasn't a systematic way that we were going about identifying those routes. And so that's what they set out to do. And they identified those factors that are listed. And then they just used those factors. Director Maka.
I think we agree we don't have to do that in these meetings.
We did agree.
We
Oh,
agree
okay.
that we get to call each other by
Okay.
our first names.
Okay.
Thank you, Director Monk.
Yeah.
He did technically use your first
This
name.
director was the one that didn't care if I'm called director.
So, but I'll look at that. I mean, I think that's what it was, and I don't remember exactly. But the board just said, well, "Look, we need better objective criteria than what they were doing." And I do think, and Charlie, I agree about not it being anecdotal, but I think we do need to talk about safety concerns that exist,
Yes.
and getting that back into this framework in one way or the other. I mean, let's talk about that neighborhood in Lincoln, right? Like, it's not just the distance, and it's not that the majority of those students that live there are either free and reduced lunch. The majority of them are. Think about that route, right? Like, we're asking those kids to walk along Riverside Drive or to cut through
And cross
paths. Yes, or to cut through paths in the woods. I mean, if there had been a safety component, I'm not sure how that neighborhood, knowing it was going there, wouldn't have scored higher in the metrics. But they took that out in 15, 16 because they were trying to look more at just those SES barriers. And so we learned from what we did, right? We were here, we swung here.
Yeah.
And now I think we have an opportunity to swing back in the middle and look at that because I just think there's some of those pieces. Now, how we identify what's a safety concern, that would then have to be something that the committee would have to talk about. Is it something that's designated as a highway? Well, Rochester is technically Herbert Hoover Highway. So if you have to walk across Rochester, is that all of a sudden a safety concern and you get a bus? That'd work well for me because we're within the walk zone for Lemmy, right? But right at the very edge. So I do empathize with a lot of these families because, like you said, I'm going to face that next year. I've got a 5-year-old that's supposed to walk 1.97 miles to Lemmy Elementary School. Now we have the means of whether it's pay to ride or some other element making that happen. But these are challenges that a lot of our families face. So
I did attend most of those meetings, and we were at the same time discussing catchment areas. And there was a lot of pushback from the board about how we should be careful to make assumptions about people who have an SES of high FRL and about whether they will get their kids to school. In fact, one of the board members said, "Don't tell me that we won't get our kids to school because we get our kids to school."
absolutely.
And so I just think we need to keep that in our context too. I found it very compelling. You know, it's an asterisk, or it's more than an asterisk. It needs to be part of the conversation, not to make those assumptions. For me, based on all those meetings I attended, I think safety would be at the top, right? Like, and all of us have had kids walking, and you can see different routes where you're like, oh, geez, I've gotten out of my car and been like, stop, you know? There are some safety concerns, and I think that's just got to be top of mind when we're looking at this.
So I agree with you. Jason says that this is sandwiching. You put it good, and then the bad, and then the good. So I'm going to sandwich. I agree with you that we should reconvene the District Transportation Committee. I think that's sorely needed. And I really like your idea of collecting data from the Lincoln route that doesn't exist. And was there one more? Was there a Weber route?
There is a Weber route.
So I would ask that we collect data from both of those routes because we can, and that we continue to collect it through the winter because it's different to have your kids walk to school in August and September than it is in January. And I'd be interested in what trends we're going to see this year in that. And I think that gets to your point is, because I agree we shouldn't make assumptions about certain areas not being able to get to school. So let's see if they're getting to school or not. And I think your point is well taken, Chase, is even if we don't see a dip in attendance, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not sacrificing things to get their kids. But if we see a huge dip in attendance, that's going to tell us something.
But wait, do you mean when do you do the, like, this is going to be a silly question. When do you start and stop the survey? Like, we don't just stop sending a bus one day and see what happens, right?
Well, we did. So we have 2 routes that we ran last year that we're not running this year.
Right, that
so
I understand.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying last year to compare to this year.
Yeah,
I just wanted to make sure I had the right controls in place.
But
that
not just the first 7 weeks of the school.
Right.
I think we should collect this data all year so that we can see trends. Now, I think the problem that I have philosophically is if we're going to target pockets in neighborhoods and move them away from the school that's closest to them and put them to a different school in the goals of balancing FRL rates at school, which we should do because that improves everybody's school. But if we're going to move kids away, like the Douglas Court kids, whose closest school is technically Horn, and walking up Benton Street to Horn is vastly different than walking further along Riverside Drive, we do owe it to them. If we're going to move them around the district to help our goals, we have to make sure we're taking care of them. And maybe we are. Maybe they don't need a bus. maybe they're all getting to school fine and it's fine. But if they're not, so I'm particularly troubled by the Douglas Court, as well as some of the other ones that I'm just kind of looking at on this chart that go from a lower FRL school to a high or flip that, from a high FRL school to a lower FRL school. Because I don't want those families to think that they're being moved and sacrificed for the betterment of other people and that those kids are getting left behind. I don't think it's fair to those families.
But that's a catchment area.
Yes, I mean, it
Conversation.
feeds in, yeah, no, it feeds in, like, why do these kids now live 1.9 miles away from the school instead of 1.4? It's because we changed the catchment areas to take them and put them at a more affluent school. If we're going to do that, which we should, I'm not saying that's a bad, but if we're going to do that, I think we owe a responsibility to those kids to make sure that they can access the school that we are putting them in.
I agree, but I think that it's not an automatic that we moved you and therefore it has to still go back to
Absolutely.
the rubric. Is
No.
it less safe? Then, okay, automatically you go through the list. Less safe, then we're going to consider it. What are the other factors? What are the other factors? You know, I don't know that for me, and again, I mean, changes of catchment area, that's what happened to us, right? We're the farthest from the school we got assigned to, which, fine. I mean, really fine. But I don't think it's relevant. I think it's only relevant if the safety is a concern, if they're beyond 2 miles, and, you know, like, I don't necessarily, we changed catchment areas to benefit everyone. That wasn't a punishment, you know?
No, but if the effect is to punish a few kids in order to better everybody else, that's what I want to make sure we're avoiding.
And I think the punishment, if it takes the form in making it less safe, then I would be willing to use the word punishment. But walking farther isn't a punishment. That's the distinction I'm trying to make.
I guess, safety's not the top of my list, because if it's an unsafe route, I have the privilege to get my kids to school. And so I want to make sure that we're not just making it easier for parents who can get their kids to school anyway without spending $34,000 on a bus, which is a lot of money. I want to make sure that we're really using our money smartly. So safety is a consideration, but I guess I think that the other tags on that, data points on that list are equally important. It's kind of a holistic approach that I would want to take.
I think that, so,
Oh, the other thing I wanted to ask too is, I remember reading and then getting an email, like, for example, why we need to look at this, the Man Forest View area. I thought the city was helping rehome those residents, because I thought we received an email that we were still going to allow those students to attend Man regardless of where they were rehomed to. And if that happened, then I wonder, you know, do we need an attendance support bus for that area?
or would it become
Yeah.
or would it move to a mandated bus, could it be further?
Correct, yeah, something like that. And so that's why, that's just one example why we should reconvene. I also am curious, you know, I'm looking at this list, if I'm reading it right, some of these areas only have 8 students, 4 students, 9 students, 10 students. It does not seem efficient to spend $35,000 busing 4 students. Is there a smaller vehicle that we could we get one of those vans that, you
Well,
know, is there a cost-effective way of providing transportation that's not a full school bus?
We can certainly look into it. The vans we normally buy, and they're, you know, what are they running, Jeff? 80?
Right now,
Yeah.
running $60,000 for those vans. And we don't supply those vans to the bus companies,
You're right.
you know, to Iowa Central.
So we'd have to
Right now.
contract that.
Like if they would want to use one of our vans for a route instead of a full-size bus.
No, we do not.
This is Esme Davis, our transportation manager, for those that don't know.
I just know, like, City High has a van that you can use when your organization needs to go on a trip, and people can drive those vans, and,
And
you
so
know.
those, and right, and we do use those vans. students. We use them for other transportation services like our McKinney-Vento students, and those numbers continue to increase. And while we try to put those students on yellow bus routes when we can, we've really seen an uptick in our use of our vans for those students because we're trying to get away from putting them on cabs. That's just not we just don't think that's safe. We don't think it's a good practice. And so we try to do away with the cabs, which has put more strain on our bus routes. And so you're right, they do, and we're trying to help the schools help us out to use their buses to get their McKinney-Vento students so that we can free up some of our other transportation services. So I understand what you're saying, and it's something we can look at. It's just how do we fit it all in that bigger picture?
Yeah.
But your point about the number, if you look at the sheet that was in this report, that's exactly why we're in the spot we are with Douglas Court and Douglas Street. There were only 10 students in that catchment area as compared to the other Horn route, which has 42 students, that is like a third of a mile less. It's about 1.6 to Horn, whereas this is 1.9 to Lincoln. It's not their home, it's not the school they're geographically closest to, the kids are Douglas Court, but that's really what tipped it over, because the break number was 13. Well, when they only have 10 students, that brought that score down, and so it knocked them out of where they would be in that priority area. So again, it's what are the factors and how are we going to weigh them?
Close numbers like that can vary from year to year.
They could. We just haven't had a mechanism to go back and look at it.
Doing the year to year
Right.
analysis.
I mean, I'm sympathetic to the money argument. It's not very convincing though to me. I mean, when we sit here on last Saturday for 3 hours and talk about our strategic goals, and the strategic goals are equity, rate, like if we are not getting our kids that already have the opportunity gap widened, if we are not getting them to school, we will not achieve the strategic goals. That's not going to happen. And so to me, it is essential that we are getting kids that need to go to school. The bus driver shortage is much more compelling. Because, I mean, there's just nothing we can do about it. There's just no way to invent bus drivers out of thin air. Unless, as we can continue to recruit friends or other administrators. We heard you were driving today. Yeah. I don't know, maybe do a bus driver drive at the ESC and get you all trained and then you guys drive routes. I don't know. Brady likes that idea. Chase driving bus. But I mean, the shortage is real and not to be discounted, but I just, coming off of the meeting on Saturday, I just don't know how we're going to meet our strategic 5-year big goals if the kids that we're trying to target can't get to school.
And that's what I'm still not getting. Why are we thinking that?
Because these are all low income.
Well, why do we think
And our
that-
low income kids are the ones that have and our little SES kids are the ones where the opportunity gap is largest.
No, I understand that connection. Why do you think they won't get to school if we don't bus them?
Well, because I've
I think
been,
that's the information that we need.
That's what I'm saying. I just think we keep operating on an assumption that I don't get.
well, I've been contacted by at least 4 families from Lincoln about the Douglas Court situation, and those kids are not going to school.
And that is important, but that's not.
And apparently that's 4 out of 10. So 40% of them have said it's because I can't get on a bus.
I'm not gonna.
The principals in each elementary school have some idea about what students.
Yeah, we need to, we'll track that data.
That's all I'm saying. I don't know why. I just want to know what the data is
Well,
before
I
I
don't-
decide what the rubric.
I don't know
would be.
how I'm gonna, without taking all those routes away, like, I don't know, I have to go back and put some thought into it. But, some of these routes have been in place since even before 2015. And so I don't know what data I'm gonna compare that to, right? Like, if a route's been going for Alexander since Alexander opened up, I don't know how I'm going to capture that data of, hey, if we take this bus away, are your kids still going to get to school? So I hear what you're saying, and I think I understand what you want about how we're going to figure this out. I'm just gotta think through how we're gonna collect those
Yeah,
data
and
points.
maybe we can't, I just don't like assumptions.
Yeah.
I just want to see what we have and look at it with as much information as
Yeah.
we can get.
Well, and so, and as me jump in here and help, and by the way, I think I misspoke earlier, like, some of these data points are missing, but Joan Vandenberg led this, and she did a tremendous job, and she knew it backwards and forwards, and so I needed to probably spend some time with her. But it was really one of these, we thought, we did make some assumptions about students that we wanted to reduce barriers for. The board basically said, here's your budget, and we could pay for this many routes with that budget. And so we looked at, okay, how are we going to identify areas where we could provide some additional transportation resources? I don't think the conversation was, do we ever need to do this? It was, here's how many mandatory routes we provide, here's the budget you have to provide some discretionary busing, figure out what areas of the district you want to provide that to.
So there is some really good data. We used it when we were working with the bond campaign about what percentage transportation has in terms of student achievement. So that there's some statewide excellent resources for that. The answer was 0.01 when the research was done. So I just am saying, again, it sounds like 5 out of 10 families at that school, and also depends on the location of the school. But the more information we can get, the better. It was either 0.01 or 0.1%. Transportation was a barrier. There was a list of a bunch of things. It was one of the things we talked about because, as you all know, catchment areas is one of my jams.
Yes,
So.
I do know. Okay, so are we okay with the next steps that we proposed, or does the committee think we need to take some different action? I'm hearing.
Well, I think we want you to reconvene this committee,
Okay.
the transportation committee. I'm hearing that we're all, like, absolutely do that, and study the ASB current routes, future routes, problem areas, get the data from the 2 routes that were discontinued, because again, we get data for 2 routes.
Right.
Because we did stop those routes.
So, these are, were we thinking too about having, go ahead and look at the route structure that would exist today if the priority rankings applied to conditions today? Is that one of the?
To re-rank all the routes. I think that's something the committee could do.
Yeah, and I think there's also a budget discussion part of it, right? Like, how much of the budget are we going to do this? But yeah, Charlie, we could.
I like being cool.
Do you have the budget first and then?
Need to work with SB on it.
I mean, it was a number, we were given a number, and it was, you have 12 buses, your budget is for the 12. Here you go. Joan and I then said, okay, this is what these are our areas, here's our rubric, ELL. I mean, you kind of went down the list from there, public transportation. And then out of that is where we went back to the SFAs, because the SFAs did, come in and decide a meeting, and it was, they provided their input as well. And so then from there, it was gathered all the data, presented it back to the SFAs, and they said, yep, those are our areas.
So that's
So
good.
it was, yes, SFAs, yes,
I'm
had all of
not,
their input in it.
I'm not
We did
super,
that again.
yeah.
Yeah, we'll pull that, yeah.
I'm not super thrilled at committee to make changes for this year. I would like us to remain flexible.
Okay.
And if we start hearing from building principals, these 10 kids in this neighborhood are not coming to school anymore. Then if we can deploy some more, maybe some more like the van or some sort of creative ride sharing to target those issues, I would be open to that, even if it costs some money out of the general fund to listen to us.
We have so much
But-
to talk about here that
Yeah.
we just have to have a committee meeting, because
Yeah.
we don't have time.
So I don't want to commit to saying we're not making any, no
Okay.
changes for the
I
year.
also know SFAs sometimes provide transportation.
Yep.
I mean, there's a lot of stuff that goes on like that.
I also think that's what's important is if it's on a public bus route too. I mean,
Another factor.
yeah, that's
Excellent factor.
It's on there.
which I think is on there, but that's a big factor.
I mean, for us as we're moving
Yeah.
forward, excellent factor.
And if we could work with the city, if we've targeted,
Yeah,
anyway, I think there's a lot of work the committee could do.
Okay.
I vote to close.
This is good.
We don't have time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, this is a great discussion.
It was a great meeting, but I think we got.
I got a motion to adjourn. Charlie, second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
I don't.